Welcome into week 9 of Why Wait Till Sunday, a top 5 college midweek college DFS podcast. I'm Chris. I'm riding solo tonight. Alfred is recovering from a well-earned weekend in Las Vegas where I think he did fairly well on the craps table, a little here and there, but happy to give him the week off and let him recuperate from a good time. So it'll be me tonight, and we'll do what we always do. We'll preview the slate of games. We'll dive into our favorite plays at each position from a high end, mid tier, low tier perspective, and hopefully keep winning some money. I think last week we did pretty good, and we've been steadily improving throughout the year as our process has gone on. So I'm really excited to preview week 9. We have a lot of games. We have 14. Usually we only have 12 or 11. So there's a lot of games, but there's also a lot of landmines. So let's start with the slate for this week. First game is Pitt and Miami. So Pitt has come in really impressing a lot of folks. They just had a big win against Clemson. They only have one loss on the year, which was a shootout to Western Michigan. The total in this game is 62.5, which is actually the second highest on the slate. Pitt is favored by 9.5, and I think that's probably fair given what we know about the Pitt offense and the struggles that we've seen from Miami. Tyler Van Dyke looked better last week than he had in their game against UNC. But this Pitt defense has steadily improved throughout the year, so I'm not quite sure we can expect a big ground game from Miami in this one. This is a game where I think we'll want to play some of the Pitt side and maybe stay away from the Hurricanes a little bit. Next game is Baylor and Texas. Baylor's actually favored in this contest by 2.5. The spread is 61.5, which is the fourth highest on the slate. And this is a game where we could see a lot of offense, I think. Baylor has been better than people realize this year. Only one loss in a tight contest against Oklahoma State, but they've been scoring 38.3 points per game, led by Gary Bohannon and the running game. Texas has struggled, especially in the rushing game. So I think Baylor has a good shot this week, and Texas is obviously led by superstar Heisman candidate, really, running back Bijan Robinson. So I think this is a game where we could see some fireworks, but with a total over 60, it's definitely one that we want to pay attention to. Another total over 60 at 62.5, but maybe one that we want to stay away from because it could be a blowout, is Cincinnati at Tulane. Cincinnati is still undefeated, but they had a close scare against Navy last week. I think that they're going to come into this game and show that they're still who we thought they were, the top G5 school in the country. And Tulane is getting a lot of credit, I think, for that close game against Oklahoma this year, but they really shouldn't be. This is a bad Tulane team that on really both sides of the ball. Michael Prassa has a concussion, so we're cautious in this matchup, and we'll probably avoid playing anybody on Tulane. Their implied team total is only 18.5. Next game is a good old barn burner with a total of 50.5 between Maryland and Indiana, two offenses that are kind of struggling a little bit. It seems like ever since the Iowa game and the loss of Dante Demas, Maryland has really not performed well. Rakeem Jarrett didn't take the next step, and they also lost Deshaun Jones. So this is an offense that's reeling. Indiana has been fairly terrible this year. Jack Tuttle started last week. I think Michael Penix is still hurt. This is not an exciting game. Maryland is favored by 4.5, but two of the lower implied team totals this week. The matchup of the week, probably from a football perspective, maybe less so from a DFS perspective, but I still think we could find value here, is Michigan and Michigan State. The total in this game is 52.5. Michigan is favored currently by 4, and Michigan has been good this year on defense, and I think they're just good enough to get it done on offense with the rushing game between Blake Corum and Hassan Haskins. Michigan State's been pretty lucky. I think they've gotten a lot of help defensively and special teams wise. This is a big test for them. If they can go into Michigan and win, I think that bodes really well for them and the rest of the season. So it'll be interesting to see how this game shakes out and how it impacts the Big Ten moving forward. Our favorite game of the week, which is just disgusting, is Wisconsin and Iowa. The total in this game is 36.5, which is by far the lowest on the slate, and it's actually the lowest of the entire weekend across every single game. Both these offenses are terrible. I don't think we really need to talk much about this game. If we're being clear, both these defenses are great. Both these offenses are terrible. 36.5 is it's a big number to think that both these teams are going to score like 16 plus points, which is the where Iowa currently stands. So I'm not crazy about this game from DFS perspective. I don't think there's a lot of value to be found here. Iowa State and West Virginia. The total in this game is 47.5, another lowish one. Iowa State's favored by 7.5. The Cyclones have played a lot better as of late. They had that bad showing to start the year, but they've really turned it on. They've had some really high quality wins. They beat Oklahoma State, who was ranked in the top 10 at the time. So that was a really solid win for the program and moving forward. West Virginia has not been what we expected this year. We expected more performance out of the back end. The secondary was really solid last year. It has not been that this year, which opens, I don't think they've really been solid anywhere. Their rush defense has been okay. They're allowing only 101 yards per game, but the rushing success rate actually ranks outside the top 50. So it tells a little bit different story as a per rush basis in terms of how successful they are at limiting opportunities. So I think that this could be a Brock. I think it's going to be a Breece Hall game, but we could even see some more Brocktober like we saw last week. An interesting SEC matchup: Georgia and Florida. Total in this game is 50.5. Georgia's favored by 14.5. I don't know if Florida can do anything against this Georgia defense. Emory Jones is starting again. I'm not sure why, but this is going to be an interesting test for the Georgia offense. Not that I think that Florida's defense is great or anything. We just saw them get killed by Florida. Or we just saw them get killed by LSU. So I'm not really sure what to expect from this Georgia offense. They are led by Stetson Bennett, but the ground game is kind of producing for them between James Cook and Zamir White. Next game is Clemson and Florida State. Clemson is currently favored by 10, and the total is 46.5. So it's another low one. Neither of these off. I think this is going to be a game of defense. Clemson's defense has been very, very solid, but Florida State has been they've been improving since the start of the year. I think Florida State's really taken a good step forward as a program since their bad start, including loss to Jacksonville State. Clemson has not been able to do anything. They were eliminated by Pitt last week, and I don't think Pitt's defense is anything to write home about. So this could be an interesting game from a value perspective. Just trying to figure out what we want to do with this contest. And then we have Oregon and Colorado. Oregon's favored by 24, and the total in this one is 49.5. Colorado comes in with the lowest implied team total of the week at 12.8. I don't think you can start a single player from Colorado, and I don't even think I can caveat that with it might be gross, but I just don't do it. I think this is a game where you can play some Oregon guys. They had the fourth highest implied team total, 36.5, 36.75. I think Travis Dye is definitely in play, but we'll talk about some of the options in the game a little bit later. Then we have what Vegas projects to be a high-scoring game in Oklahoma, Texas Tech. The total here is 66. Oklahoma's favored by 19.5. Oklahoma's really come together a little bit in the last couple of weeks, but since Caleb Williams has taken over, they had a scare against Kansas, but I don't really think that that's the offense's fault. They came together in the second half. They had a poor showing in the first half. I think they just were looking ahead against this Jayhawks team. The Jayhawks took advantage. They had two big drives to start the game, and that were long and limited time possession early in the first half, but they got it together. I think Texas Tech's defense is terrible, really, in both the rushing and passing. So I think this is a game where you can start a lot of players on both sides because Oklahoma's still missing a ton of options on the back end. I think they're still missing 4 of their top 5 corners. So this is a game that I think we'll target and we'll actually talk a lot about later. Next game, another Big 12 shootout. Kansas State at TCU. Kansas State favored by 3.5. The total here is 58.5. Kansas State plays a very slow pace. They're 117th in seconds between plays. And I think they're just going to run. This is going to be a Deuce Vaughn game. Some Skylar Thompson on the ground, short passes maybe to Phillip Brooks. But I think the plays on the other side are probably more in the passing game. I think we'll see a little bit of explosiveness from TCU. And I think we could talk about what we expect from Duggan and Quentin Johnston. But this is an interesting game, and I think the total might be a little bit high based on our expectation for this game. Last two, first, Nebraska and Purdue. Purdue's favored by 8. Purdue's coming off that big win against Iowa, and then they fell flat on their face, which is not surprising if you know the Purdue program. I do think that Purdue is going to limit Nebraska, and Heisman Martinez has been solid this year, but I don't really love him in this matchup. It's a low total at 50, so I think we can highlight a couple players in this game like David Bell, but overall, I think this is a game you probably want to stay away from. And one of the highest totals on the week is Wake Forest and Duke. Wake Forest is favored by 17.5, and the total is 71. I think that this is going to be another Wake Forest massive explosion game. I think Vegas probably has this one right. I expect a lot of the Wake Forest players to be fairly popular because of what we saw last week. But again, I don't think they'll be too popular where you can avoid them. And I think there's a little bit of value to be had on the Duke side here, which makes it fairly interesting. And so we can, I think we can talk about that game a little bit as time goes on. But overall, there's a couple nice games on this slate, and giving us so many, I think, helps with that, because Iowa was here, Wisconsin was here, and we also get some higher end matchups like this Wake Forest and Duke one. So let's head over to quarterbacks. The most expensive one on the slate is Caleb Williams. Caleb Williams comes in at 10,000, which makes sense given how solid he's been really for the whole year. I think this is in a void for me at 10,000, because then there are better options that are $1,000 to $1,200 cheaper than Caleb Williams. I'm not saying don't play him, because I think he'll be good. The Texas Tech is a great matchup for them. I just think this might be a more so of Kennedy Brooks game, and I don't know how high his ceiling is compared to some of the other guys that might actually be in legitimate shootouts. I still like Caleb Williams. He's just slightly cost prohibitive. Second highest guy is a guy I actually really do like, which is Sam Hartman. I think he'll be popular, so I'm a little bit worried, but he had 457 passing yards last week, 6 touchdowns. One of those was a rushing touchdown. Duke ranked 63rd in passing defensive success rate. I'm not really scared of the Duke defense. The only concern that I actually have in this game is that Wake Forest gets out to such a huge lead and Duke can't score, which means they kind of have to pack it in and run it a little bit. Wake Forest defense has not been good. We saw them get run on against Army last week. I think that Duke might be able to keep it close enough to keep Wake Forest passing. Total 71. Wake has an implied team total for that's the most on the slate with 44.25. So I think this is a really nice matchup for Hartman. I think you could play him again this week if you really want to. The third highest quarterback, who I really like as well, is Kenny Pickett. Apparently, it's Kenny Pickett Heisman season. He's averaging 32.3 DraftKings points per game this year, and he comes in with the 5th highest implied team total on the slate. Miami's pass defense is okay, but with the level that Pitt and Pickett really has been playing at for the entire year, I don't mind playing him. $8,800 is $1,200 off of Caleb Williams, and I think that dollar for production Pickett is a better play because Pitt isn't really running the ball effectively. It's a lot of their production is coming from the passing game, and Kenny Pickett's just playmaking ability. The third most expensive guy is Desmond Ridder. I don't like him this week, and I haven't really liked him because he isn't as running as much as you kind of would like to see. A lot of his production is coming through the air, and I think that makes sense given that he wants to prove that he can be an NFL quarterback, and it has to kind of show off his arm a little bit more. We were seeing that from Malik Willis at Liberty as well. So I don't really like Ridder here, even though it's a great match against Tulane. If we move a little bit further down, a guy that I like at 7,200 is Gary Bohannon. So I've actually talked about him a bunch this year. He's been up and down a little bit, but Texas is averaging 41 points per game. And although Baylor's defense has been solid, I think they can score here. I think they can run with Bijan. I think that Casey Thompson will be okay. Bohannon gets the 91st ranked pass defense and success rate and has the mobility to put up big game rushing where Texas was really poor. They ranked bottom 30 in most key rushing statistics. So I think this is a game where we can – I do think this is a game where we can target Bohannon and the Baylor offense. I think he's a sneaky upside play. And at 7,200, you don't need him to have like a 50-point week. But I do think that's in his range of outcomes because of how solid he has been. So one more play that I like for quarterbacks, and I think this is a pretty thin quarterback slate, to be honest. I don't think there's a ton of matchups, which goes back to the idea that if you want to play Caleb Williams, feel free to. I think you can because there aren't a lot of good matchups this week for quarterbacks. There aren't a lot of great games, a lot of great quarterbacks on the slate. But the last one that I do like is in that Oklahoma game, except it's on the other side, and it's Henry Colombi. So I've talked about Colombi a little bit this year, and I keep hyping him up, and then he keeps letting me down. But I don't think it's necessarily Colombi's fault as much as it is kind of just bad touchdown luck. So he did throw for 148 and 124 in his last 2 games, but he does have 2 over 300 yards and 1 over 266 in his 5 games starting this year. He just hasn't scored touchdowns. They scored 4 rushing touchdowns 2 weeks ago. They scored 3 last week. I think that Columbia only needs to start scoring a couple touchdowns, and we look at him a lot differently. At 5,400 against the Oklahoma secondary, who is missing a lot of key pieces in the secondary, it's going to be a good matchup for Columbia. And I think this is the week that he can put together a performance at 5,400 that could really win you a tournament. So I really, really like Columbia this week. I'll move on to running backs. The highest price guy, Alfred and I were lamenting this a couple weeks ago. What is going on, with Bijan? Why is he only priced at like 7,200? Well, now he's 9,700. And although I can't endorse not playing Bijan, I think you can if you have the space. I do think this is a little bit risky. Baylor's defense has been very good this year, and I'm a little bit worried that he won't have the massive game to justify the salary, right? So it is a little bit more than Bijan will score 25 points. It's will Bijan hit the 40 points that you need or 45 points that you need to justify salary? I don't think so, which is why I'm pivoting even further down than Deuce Vaughn, who good matchup, but 9,400 is a lot. I'm going down to Jerome Ford. I'm going back to Jerome Ford because I've been on him a couple weeks in a row. Tulane's terrible on defense. They rank 90th in defensive success rate against the run and giving up an explosive rush rate of 24.1%, which ranked 111th in the country. He should be the focal point of that offense, and they're favored by 24.5. And I think they're just going to run up the score as much as they can in the first half. Maybe take the gas off late in the fourth, but I think Cincinnati can score 45-plus points this week, and I think Jerome Ford's going to be a huge part of that. So I really like Jerome Ford as well. Next is Breece Hall, a guy I really like this week. After struggling early, which he absolutely did, he's been pretty much locked in as a stud for the last couple of weeks. He had Oklahoma State last week, which wasn't a great matchup, so he didn't do fantastic. But prior to that, he did have 4 straight 100-yard games, going over 190 twice. This week, he gets a Mountaineers defense whose advanced stats paint like an okay picture. They're ranked 60th in success rate against the run, but Hall is still averaging 27 weighted opportunities, which weights targets 1.5 times more than rushes. He should see that this week, and I'm not really scared of the Mountaineers defense. The next 2 guys I think are interesting to talk about, Travis Dye and Kennedy Brooks. Both have been really solid recently. I think you can absolutely play Travis Dye. He's just the workhorse in that backfield. 8,700 is a great price for him, and Colorado has been terrible. The risk that you run is they want to get the backups a little bit more run against a Colorado team that is not going to keep the game close. But I do think Dye is in play. Not my favorite play, but he is in play. Kennedy Brooks, again, I think this is a game where we see more Caleb Williams than Brooks, probably. I go back and forth on that, but 8,400, I think there's just other guys that I like a little bit more that are cheaper with a easier path to, I think, an explosive week that can win you that sort of GDP that we're looking for. And one of those guys is Mateo Durant. And I think this is risky, right? Because Wake is favored by 2+ touchdowns, and Duke is not a good passing offense. But we just saw Wake Forest get lit up on the ground against a triple option Army defense. We've seen Mateo Durant put up really solid statistics this year on a bad Duke team. I think you can play Durant at 7,700, and I do think there's a risk involved. I do think that's the way that Duke is going to score. So Durant, who's averaging 27.8 points per game already, I think he could hit that, and I don't think that's a bad price for him to give you a couple more options. The final guy that I like, and there aren't a lot of good values with running backs either. I think a lot of the places where we're looking for value as a receiver this week is Abram Smith from Baylor. So he's 7,200 against Texas. I think he's a little bit too discounted, to be honest. I think he should be closer to the 8K range. He gets a Texas defense that ranks 85th in defensive success rate against the run and 115th in explosive rush rate allowed. He's averaging 22.6 DraftKings points. He's kind of taken over as the workhorse there. I think he is probably going to be the way that Baylor wins. I think he and Gary Bohannon running on the ground is how Baylor is going to see some success. I'm not crazy about the receiving option in this game, but I do really like Abram Smith. And at 7,200, it's kind of a nice discount here. So I think there's a couple more options that you could potentially look at, but there aren't really great matchups this week. This is a lot more of a defensive slate and not great offenses. even if they're playing mech defenses. So, Blake Corum and Hassan Haskins are in play, but I don't really know what the split's going to look like. And is Michigan State's defense bad enough to keep both in play? Probably not. Serrato Thompson's overpriced. Oklahoma's better on the ground than they are through the air. Braylon Allen, I would not start him against Iowa. Jashawn Corbin, no way. That's a tough matchup against Clemson. So there really aren't a lot of great matchups that you want to target this week. I do think that the Pitt running backs could be interesting. Israel Abanikanda at 5,200. If we find out that he's cleared from concussion protocol, then he's a guy that I think you can play. And if he's not cleared, then I think you target. You can potentially target Vincent Davis, who is only 3,900. I think he would probably be almost a must start at sub 4K as the lead undisputed back in the Pittsburgh offense, which is kind of splitting carries between the two. So that's something to watch for the rest of the week. I do like Vincent Davis if it breaks down that way. So let's head over to wide receivers, or just receivers, because I actually like some tight ends this week as well. And the highest price guy on the slate, no surprise here, is Corey Roberson, who had a monster game last week against Army. And I actually like him again this week. He's only $100 more than A.T. Perry, who had a very solid week last week as well. But over the last 3 games, Roberson has 22 targets to A.T. Perry's 16, and he's really become the focal point for Sam Hartman. So I think he's the one that you want to stack with Hartman, to be honest, in this matchup. I don't think it's crazy to play him again this week and think that he's going to produce against a Duke team who's really not that impressive through the air. I think that we've seen some huge offensive performances this year against them, especially with good passing games. Virginia tore them up. North Carolina tore them up. So I think that Wake and Sam Hartman could do the same. A.T. Perry, like I said, is the second one. I'd much rather play Roberson. Then we have Xavier Hutchinson, who had a really good week last week, and I actually think that he's in play this week, but he's not a priority target for me. I think that they're just better options, to be honest. Next is Jordan Addison. If he gets cleared, you can obviously play him at 7,200. He's always locked and loaded. He's a wide receiver 1 in that offense, but I'm a little bit worried about injury and what that means, and especially if I think they're going to pull away from this Miami team. I think they're much better than Miami. So what that means for him, I think that we can look at the secondary receivers there more so. And then we get to a guy who I think is way too discounted in David Bell. He's averaging 10.2 targets per game, 25.6 DraftKings points per game. Purdue is the 10th highest implied team total, and this Nebraska defense isn't really anything where I'm scared of. He has Aiden O'Connell at quarterback, and he disappointed last week, so he's a little bit cheaper. We just saw him put up 200+ yards against Iowa. Nebraska does not scare me. He is locked in for at least 10 targets, I think, this week. I think he is way too discounted at 7,100. So I love David Bell this week. Quentin Johnston, also at 7,100. We're assuming that this game becomes maybe a little bit of a shootout, or at least Texas Tech or Texas Christian can target Kansas State through the air. They rank 116th in passing success rate on defense. Johnston is a clear alpha there. He has 19 targets in his last 3 games, and he's averaging 21 points as is, and had the huge game last week, but he's also averaging 12 unrealized fantasy points per game, which is a calculation that's based on how many targets you have, what your YAC looks like, your average depth of target that we've kind of put together over campuscan.com this year. And, I really like his opportunity. I think he's going to keep smashing, and I think he's, again, too cheap on the slate, and I think he and Duggan could connect again like they did last week. A little bit further down I got another guy I like is Jadon Hazelwood, who I'm surprised that I'm saying this, but he has 19 targets in his last 3 games, and nobody else has more than 10. So he's become the clear wide receiver 1 for Caleb Williams since taking over. 6,700 really isn't a bad price to get the wide receiver 1 on an offense that we think is going to score a lot of points this week. I'm not crazy about Caleb Williams, but I will play Jadon Hazelwood probably a little bit. I think that he's probably $500 to $600 cheaper than I expected him to be. So that's a good price point for him and in a good matchup. Moving a little bit further down, I think there's a couple names that we kind of like. I think Marvin Mims is in play at 5,900. I think as a Conma is in play for the same reason that we were talking about the Texas Tech Oklahoma game. But I'm going down to Jake Bobo first. And Jake Bobo is an interesting case because he's really I'll say alpha in the Duke offense as much as there can be when he's averaging over 9 targets per game, 16.7 DraftKings points, and he gets a Wake defense who's struggling. I know that a lot of the production came on the ground last week, but I think Duke could probably put up a couple points, and Bobo's the guy to target here. He's actually $700 less than Jalen Calhoun on the own team, and I'm not sure why Calhoun comes in more considering he's out targeting and has more receptions and running more routes than Calhoun. So I think Bobo, 5,600 for Duke against Wake is an interesting play. And then I said as Akanma could be in play this week, but I actually prefer Kalen Geiger. So he has 12 targets over his last 3, which is only 2 behind as Akanma, but he's getting a $1,600 discount. Oklahoma's, like I've said this whole show, that they're down their key pieces in secondary. I think 4 of their top 5 defensive backs or 3 of their top 4 defensive backs are out, still not healthy. And I think this is a game where we could see Geiger go off. So I don't mind stacking Columbia and Geiger. I think you can obviously stack as Akanma if you want to, but I think Geiger is the one that's going to get you savings. And maybe he's flying a little bit under the radar. So I think he's really interesting this week. And a guy that I'll have in a couple places. Right behind him is Tazir Mack. So I talked about Jordan Addison that, you didn't need to play Jordan Addison. He's great, obviously, but Mack is $2,500 cheaper at $4,700. And he's 14 targets to Addison's 15 over the last 3. He actually leads the team in routes run over his last 3 games, and he has 6.8 unrealized fantasy points per game this season. So I think that Tazir Mack is really due for a blow-up game at some point this year. So he's a guy that I really, really like to target in this matchup. I think that he's somebody that you can find value on in that explosive pit offense that might fly under the radar. And at under 5K, I think that's a great value for their second leading receiver. And then, there's a couple more options. I think you can play, Payne Durham from Purdue. He's obviously their second option. I think you could play a guy like Ladd McConkey if you really wanted to, which is disgusting. But I think that, I think that they could throw this week. Actually, you know what? I take that back. Don't play Ladd McConkey. I just like his name, but let's not even get gross. We don't have to get gross because there's another guy on the same team at 3,300. Adonai Mitchell, who I think you want to play instead. The Florida pass D has not been great. Mitchell actually leads the team in targets over the last 2 weeks, and he's the cheapest of all their starters. So he's $1,000 to $1,200 savings off of Karis Jackson and Ladd McConkey, and I think he's the guy that you're going to want to have in this matchup for Georgia because I think that Georgia's going to want to throw a little bit. And I think he's going to be the preferred target. Him and Brock Bowers are tied for the team lead over the last couple games with 8. So 3,300 is a really nice price for Adonai Mitchell, in my opinion. I think another guy a little bit more expensive is Charlie Kohler, who is a tight end that I like. 14 targets over his last 2. West Virginia is bottom 30 in key passing defensive stats. I talked about how poor they were in defensive success rate. So I really like Kohler this week instead of Xavier Hutchinson, right? He's a huge discount off of him, and Kohler's still heavily involved. So you need maybe 60 yards. 60 yards, 6 catches, and a touchdown, and you're feeling great about your play of Kohler, which I think is absolutely in play this week. I actually think Iowa State could break 28, 30 points, which would mean that I think Charlie Kohler actually has a big day on the ground. So there is a couple different ways to attack that matchup, and I think that Kohler's my preferred way to do it here. I think that he is somebody that we can really hop onto. And then one last guy, it's kind of weird, but Miles Marshall at Indiana has become really their locked-in wide receiver 2 behind Ty Fryfogle, and he's been pretty good, I should say, in terms of opportunities, but we haven't seen it really come all together. So he's only averaging 5 points per game, but he has 12 targets in his last 3, and Ty Fryfogle has 13. So he's taking steps forward that we want to see. He has 6.5 unrealized fantasy points. Again, under 4K, we're looking at a guy who could have a solid game against a Maryland defense who, they rank 108th in explosive pass rate. They are allowing 260 yards per game. I'm not crazy about this Maryland secondary. So I think that Indiana, I don't trust the quarterback situation there, but I do think that Miles Marshall is a guy that you can target. And he's $1,200 cheaper than Ty Fryfogle, who I think Maryland will key in on. So there's a couple of good values this week, but overall, I think the strategy really is you have to pay up because the secondary options are not as strong, and the value options everywhere except wide receiver are not as strong. So pay up at running back, pay up at quarterback, and then mix and match at wide receiver. I think wide receiver got inappropriately priced this week, so I think there's a good chance to execute some really solid lineups that pay down at wide receiver, but are heavy on the top end running backs and quarterbacks. So I'm excited. It's a shame Alfred wasn't here. I know he's still recovering from his Vegas weekend, but he'll be back next week, and hopefully, we win some money this week, and we're back at it, and we keep the show. We can keep the lights on here. So for Why Till Sunday, I'm Chris. You can find me Chris Moxley 19 on Twitter, and let's kill this week, guys and gals.